A sonic boom over Washington, D.C. just solved the mystery of Maylasia Air Flight 370, and nobody's talking about it. Hello, welcome back. I know it's been a while since I posted a video. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but right now I'm going to jump into what happened a couple of weeks ago in Washington, D.C. when a Cessna Citation 560 overflew the Capitol, resulting in a supersonic intercept by a couple of F-16s out of Andrews Air Force Base. It's funny how these things get processed because the national news networks were quick to float the notion that depressurization might be to blame for the event, which was a Part 91 flight between a small airport in Elizabethton, Tennessee to Long Island MacArthur Airport in New York City. The interesting thing to me is not so much the fact that the media were quick to blame depressurization. One of the F-16 drivers reported that the pilot was passed out, which made that an easy conclusion, but that the flight path in this particular example is reminiscent of Maylasia Air Flight 370, which disappeared over the Indian Ocean 9 years ago. Now, of course, when I say reminiscent, I'm not talking about the location. These two flights occurred literally on opposite sides of the planet. What I'm referring to is the fact that both aircraft lost radio contact with ground controllers prior to turning around and heading back towards the airport that they had departed from. There's something else that's going to come into play here. The Cessna Citation in the incident over Virginia was operated single pilot. Maylasia Air 370 was a Boeing 777, which, of course, was flown by two pilots. However, one of the pilots was brand new to the aircraft. He was undergoing initial operating experience where a check airman flies with a newly type-rated pilot. In one case, you had a light jet being operated sans a second pilot. In the other, a heavy airliner with a relatively inexperienced first officer. Now, both aircraft, the 777 and the Cessna 560, are required to be operated by two pilots, but there is a carve-out for Cessna 560 owners. As long as the aircraft is not being operated for hire, there is an exemption which allows for single pilot operations. The caveat is that flights under the exemption are restricted to Part 91. This has always been a weird aspect of aviation. Part 135 and 121 rules, which regulate flying for hire, are often more restrictive since paying passengers may not fully comprehend the risks of less restrictive rules. So, in order to protect those passengers, regulators limit what commercial operators can and cannot do. One of these limitations, with a few exceptions, is that you need two pilots for commercial flying. There's a good reason for this, as there's a long history of accidents in single-pilot operations. A second set of eyes in a kinetic environment is invaluable. Regulators do not want to foist the dangers of single-pilot operations on a plane load of clueless passengers. It's kind of an odd situation. A lot of people who sit in the back of a Part 91 flight don't know much about aviation. The only differentiator is they're not putting cash down for an airline ticket, and there are fewer seats in the back of the airplane. It's a little bit arbitrary to protect a certain class of people from risks based solely on whether money exchanged hands, but it's a line that exists. In many states, you don't have to wear a helmet if you ride a motorcycle. Buyer beware, or, in this case, passengers. The NTSB just released a preliminary report, and there are a few details in there that was missed by the landslide and media attention the crash generated. The pilot, and I'll get more into this in a minute, had a substantial amount of aeronautical experience. 34,500 hours total time. He had less time in the accident aircraft, reporting 850 hours total, with 110 of those coming in the prior 12 months. The pilot in the aircraft departed Melbourne Airport in Florida at 10:59 to Elizabethton Municipal Airport in Tennessee, where it landed at 12:31. On the ground, the aircraft picked up 300 gallons of Jet A and 3 passengers. They departed, and if you're superstitious, this will get your attention, at 13:13 local time. The last communication between the pilot and controllers occurred 12 minutes later when the airplane was cleared to flight level 340. 3 minutes after this, controllers attempted to contact the pilot to amend that altitude, as it was an eastbound flight which should have been assigned an odd altitude, 33,000 feet in this case. The flight was 600 miles long, call it 100 minutes in duration. Now, 300 pounds of Jet A is only a couple thousand pounds of fuel, and the 560 burns close to 1,500 pounds per hour at high-speed cruise. There's no word on how much fuel was on board when the Citation landed in Elizabethton, but it looks to have made it to its intended destination of Long Island before turning around and flying for an additional hour until it entered a steep dive. Evidence of a post-impact fire was present, which indicates at least some fuel was present, but the NTSB doesn't comment on how substantial that fire was. It was a high-speed vertical impact, so residual fuel and oil would have likely ignited regardless. A flameout due to fuel starvation is a good bet for what preceded the stall and the spiral dive. The armchair analysis from the mainstream media is that the aircraft depressurized and everyone on board passed out due to hypoxia, which of course is a technical term for oxygen deprivation. If you choke someone out, they're hypoxic just before they pass out. Now, it's not criminal in aviation, but when it happens, it can still be violent. When an aircraft depressurizes at altitude, air pressure decreases, which means less oxygen for the brain. Since the human body is an inefficient pressure vessel, the air in the lungs will equalize with the air in the ambient environment. Fewer air molecules per volume of air means less oxygen in each breath. Eventually, you'll pass out and, if the hypoxia is severe enough, die. However, this doesn't happen instantaneously. If you want to know what it's like to be hypoxic, initially it's an awful lot like being drunk. Indeed, there's a form of hypoxia called hystoxic hypoxia, which is caused by alcohol. What booze does, technically, is reduces the ability of cells to use the oxygen that is being circulated by the blood. It also reduces self-awareness and judgment, which can be fun at a party, but in an aircraft is dangerous. 18,000 feet above sea level on a standard day represents half of the air that exists at sea level. Though people can adapt to living at higher elevations, by the time you get up to the cruise altitude of a jet in the mid-30s, things start to go awry very quickly. There is an important concept that's buried in all of this, and that's useful consciousness. Equally important is rapid versus gradual depressurization. In the case of a Cessna 560, which possesses a small volume cabin, the aircraft can depressurize much more quickly than, say, a heavy Boeing 777. When a cabin depressurizes rapidly enough, there will be significant differential pressure between the ambient environment and the lungs. Imagine Mike Tyson punching you as hard as he can in the stomach. Not only are you no longer absorbing oxygen, but your body is subject to the physiological trauma of a massive amount of air exploding from your lungs via differential pressure. At 35,000 feet, which was a cruise altitude of the Cessna 560 on this flight, the time of useful consciousness following a rapid depressurization is extremely short. FAA tables put it at around 15 seconds. Although you have to recognize that the term useful consciousness is itself a little bit gray. In order to make a scientific table, you need to experiment on test subjects, so you grab a load of Air Force cadets and stuff them into a hyperbolic chamber which you then depressurize, and then you measure how long they can do math. What's not a part of this experiment is the surprise factor or the shock of an actual depressurization at altitude, which also includes severely cold temperatures. At 35,000 feet, the external temperature is going to be around minus 40. And if you're wondering whether that's Celsius or Fahrenheit, the answer is both. Negative 40 is where those two units of measurement meet. More practically speaking, whatever the unit of measurement is, it's damn cold. So you're flying along peaceful and easy, and then wham, air is blowing all over the place, the temperature drops 100 degrees, you don't know what the hell just happened, and your body has started a rapid countdown to incapacitation. You're not going to survive unless you have a sprung-loaded response to don an oxygen mask. 10,000 feet is a magic number above which pilots generally should be wearing oxygen masks in an unpressurized aircraft, but most people can still function reasonably well up to the mid-teens. The inappropriate flight path and lack of communication combined with responding fighter pilots' observations that the Cessna pilot was slumped over the controls are a strong indicator that the pilot was incapacitated. Hypoxia brought on by a lack of cabin pressure could be the cause. The pilot had retired from Southwest Airlines with significant flying experience, so his pedigree wasn't the culprit. He was, however, older, which increases the odds of health-related incapacitation apart from hypoxia. The main thing going against medical incapacitation is the fact that none of the occupants aboard seemed to realize that anything was amiss. A relatively short hop to Long Island resulted in a 180-degree turn over the destination, followed by an F-16 intercept. If the cabin was pressurized, you'd figure one of the other occupants would have begun to wonder what was going on and stuck their heads up front. In such circumstances, passengers typically figure out how to use a radio to ask for help. Now this is where the story gets a little convoluted. The three passengers in the back were a mother who was a real estate agent out of New York, her baby, and a nanny. The mother was the adopted daughter of a wealthy Florida couple who hadn't met her until she was already an adult. The couple's biological daughter had died in a scuba diving accident when she was 19, and the Florida couple stated that the woman reminded them of her. They adopted her, she got a plane ride on a jet they owned, and she and her child died tragically. It's all very sad, punctuated by the incessant need of the media to gloss over an unbearable moment for the couple in order to focus on the fact that they were Trump supporters and high-level members of the NRA. Neither of those details have any bearing on the plane crash, but the media can't seem to help themselves. They succumb to the perpetual desire to handicap the tragedy based upon the beliefs of the people who experience it. Now, the fouled up politics aren't my concern here. The point is that this woman and her nanny quite likely had little experience with private air travel. The flight deck to them may have been an off-limits place where only pilots are allowed. And they perhaps were not sophisticated enough air travelers to note the unusualness of a 180-degree turn, or that the flight was lasting longer than it should have. An F-16 in formation outside would have most likely cued them to the abnormality, but it is far from impossible that they were somehow not aware of the kerfuffle. People sleep on planes, they watch movies, and they sometimes pull the shades. All of this is to say that pilots occasionally die in flight from heart attacks, and in single pilot operation that can be a real problem for your passengers. Still, the hypoxia theory has good merit. Also going forward is that fits more neatly into my Malaysia Air Flight 370 narrative, so that's a road we're going to go down. Out of the many jobs that I've had in aviation, check airman is one, which is an instructor and evaluator for airline pilots. One of the scenarios we run in check rides is a failure of pneumatic air conditioning sources, which will eventually result in depressurization. In the simulator, we can't recreate the debilitating effects of a loss in ambient air pressure, but we can trigger the aircraft warning system to indicate increasing cabin altitude. Now, the proper response to that is to descend immediately to a lower altitude. If the aircraft cabin altitude goes above 10,000 feet, the required crew response, pretty much on any pressurized aircraft, is to don the oxygen mask. In a check ride environment where the crew knows that they are being evaluated, it is remarkable how many times they fail to rapidly descend to a lower altitude and how many times they fail to don their oxygen masks when the cabin altitude exceeds 10,000 feet. Toss in startle factor with rapidly diminishing mental capacity, and you have a near guarantee for disaster. Add in the fact that pilots do not often don their oxygen masks. In some cases, they may go years without putting one on, and it's remarkable that we do not see more of these kinds of accidents every single year. A single pilot encounter with rapid depressurization is an extremely dangerous event. Pilots are drilled to maintain control of the aircraft first and foremost, but this is one scenario where an ingrained reflex to fly the aircraft is wrong. The most important thing during high altitude depressurization is to get sufficient oxygen. With two pilots on board, you double the likelihood that someone will get their oxygen mask on before it's too late. This allows one pilot to fixate on flying while the other focuses on consciousness. Now, in the case of Malaysia Air 370, the depressurization theory is a little bit more complex. In general, a large aircraft that's hauling around a substantial volume of air will not depressurize all that rapidly. The window of useful consciousness, as a result, is much longer, maybe more than a minute. There was a dynamic on this flight to offset this advantage, though, an inexperienced first officer paired with a check airman. In a normal crew environment, two separate pilots perceive a threat and react to it from different viewpoints. If one of them senses that the response is inappropriate, they challenge the other one. When one of the pilots is relatively inexperienced and the other is a check airman, the dynamic of challenge response can collapse. If the check airman becomes focused on flying the aircraft or diagnosing the issue, which isn't totally an inappropriate response, it is altogether possible for the delay in donning the oxygen mask to last just long enough for mental functioning to be degraded by hypoxia. And as judgment becomes impaired, it becomes less likely that either pilot will suddenly arrive at an appropriate action. If we assume a depressurization event, the next question is, why'd the aircraft turn around? The answer is most likely found buried in the term useful consciousness. It's not a straight line from normal mental functioning to a state of oblivion. Hypoxia is kind of like having shots. Your first 3 tequilas are going to give you a sense of euphoria. You'll be thinking mostly straight, but your capabilities will decrease. By the time you get to your 8th shot, the stuff you're doing is going to become disjointed. If you're a pilot, you may end up thinking, something's wrong. I need to turn back. It's not a bad impulse, but when an oxygen-deprived mind squeezes the intellect out of our lizard brain, the flight path may end up looking funny. The pilot inputs a new navigational command, the aircraft turns around, and you drift over the hills of Virginia or the desolation of the Indian Ocean. At some point, you pass out, and the aircraft goes along in a straight line until it flames out. Now, this isn't a perfect explanation. It fits into the category of speculation. In the Cessna 560, it appears as though the pilot was incapacitated well before the aircraft did a 180-degree turn over Long Island and headed back in the direction of the departure airfield. As of right now, there's no good explanation for this. In the case of Malaysia Air 370, the 777 did a 180-degree turn and flew back over Malaysia, but not directly towards the airport. The point here is that a bit of navigational mystery may not be all that inconsistent with either hypoxia or incapacitation. I started working on a script for Malaysia Air 370 a couple of months ago, and this thing over Virginia has fired me back up. Like I said earlier, it's been a while since I dropped a video. Part of the reason why is because we wound up selling a house and buying a new one. I also got tapped to be a technical consultant for a Weather Channel episode about a crash in Alaska that took the lives of 2 congressmen in 1972. One of the last recreations I did on this channel was actually about that particular crash, though the British production company who's filming the series failed me not because of that, but rather due to an article that I wrote for Twin and Turbine magazine a couple of years ago on the same subject. All that is to say that I haven't had any excess time to focus on this channel. My schedule's opening up now, so I'm going to start dropping videos again soon. Malaysia Air is on deck, though it may take a while to do that one. There's a ton of source material to sift through. Malaysian authorities issued a report. There's a lot of stuff from China. The flight was going there, and most of the passengers were Chinese nationals. And Australia got involved as well, as they were central in the search for the missing aircraft. And of course, the media coverage was overwhelming. There's an unusual abundance of material, which is both a blessing and a curse. While researching the crash over Virginia, I came across another Cessna 560 crash in the Northwest with some similar circumstances. Adding to the theme, it's not my first encounter with Cessna 560s. In the article I wrote for Twin and Turbine about the disappearance of Congressmen Hale Boggs and Nick Bykick, I also covered the crash of a Cessna 560 in icing conditions while on approach to Pueblo Airport in Colorado. Unfortunately, there's a never-ending list of curious accidents which have claimed the lives of countless people. Hopefully I can make their deaths worth something, either by preventing other accidents by their example or by helping people to be more introspective about what's important in life. I also want to thank those of you who commented on my last video. I was having a crisis of confidence about what I'm doing with this channel, and several of you gave me valuable feedback. I'm probably going to be expanding what I'm doing a little bit. I kind of wanted to do that anyways, but I'm not going to worry in the future so much about YouTube's analytics. If I get a ton of viewers, great. If I don't, I know that I'm doing something that's impactful for many of you, and that's enough. I would love to get some more resources in order to increase my production values here, but that's not going to be my motivation for these projects going forward. Delivering this stuff in an impactful way that's useful to you is more important to me, and so I'm going to keep my focus on that. Keep an eye out. I'm going to do those 2 Cessna 560 accident recreations as a lead into Malaysia Air 370. It's going to be a series of sorts, so we'll see how that works out. Thanks again for watching. Be safe out there.